Testing. There you go.
Okay, we'll reconvene, and we've got a submission from Mr. Tony Michelle on behalf of NZ Helicopter Association.
And also agricultural aviation.
And agricultural aviation. After you, Tony.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you here today. So perhaps we'll deal with them in two different tranches because they are two slightly different topics for us. I'm the Executive Officer of the New Zealand Agricultural Aviation Association. We're one of 6 divisions of the Aviation Industry Association. Do I take it you've already read the statements? That's cool. So what I'd like to do is really just hit some some of the main points before we take any questions. We acknowledge, and so on behalf of the NZAAA, firstly, we acknowledge that some of the amendments proposed in the 42A reports are appropriate for providing for agricultural aviation activities, while other recommendations are not. The recommendation in the 42A report Appendix A that noise R/10 now 9 clause 2 permits takeoff and landings for no more than 315 hours in a 12-month period is supported in part subject to the addition of the word aircraft hours to prevent ambiguity. Aircraft hours are measured from when the aircraft leaves the ground to when it touches down. Time spent loading or refuelling on the ground with the aircraft engine running at flight idle is not recorded as an aircraft hour. Suitable weather conditions are required for aircraft to land and take off safely. In ideal conditions, which we've had in Southland for the last 6 weeks, pilots will take off with the maximum certified load of agricultural product. In deteriorating conditions, the load will be reduced to provide for an appropriate margin of safety. So due to weather and supply logistics, such as fertiliser deliveries onto strips, operating hours can vary from for less than 1 aircraft hour to 10.5 aircraft hours in a single day that might span over 15 to 16 actual daylight hours. We oppose the inclusion of a 500-metre setback for rural airstrips and helicopter landing areas from the notional boundary of a noise-sensitive activity not located on the same site. The S42A report justification relies heavily on other plans, and I draw your attention to Timaru, where the 42A writer has come back with a proposed modification to the rule post the hearings, but this recommendation is still subject to decision. So GRUS 14R14A, per 2, there will be no setbacks applied for agricultural aviation activities. Further point out that the 42A report does not consider emission reduction obligations. In addition to that, other district plans are currently under review that do not include setbacks, and they are listed in the statement, but I would like to just add for context that there are 2 other plans we're dealing with at the moment that do incorporate setbacks. One's Waimakariri, and we're waiting on decisions there, and we have opposed the setbacks proposed there. The Mackenzie Plan Change 23 Rural Chapter decisions have imposed setbacks, and we've actually lodged an appeal with the Environment Court, and that is one of the matters we are taking up with that particular with those decisions. The NZAAA has identified at least 4 existing rural airstrips and 18 helicopter landing areas that are within 500 metres of a notional boundary of a noise-sensitive area, not on the same site in the Gore area. These are generally neighbours' houses and buildings. These come from 4 operators who are members. There are other operators who are non-members of the organisation that we haven't canvassed, so that list is likely to be greater than the 24 that we have identified. So Section 10.2 of the RMA determines that existing use rights lapse when a use of land that contravenes a rule in a district plan or a proposed district plan has been discontinued for a continuous period of more than 12 months. The application of fertilisers and agrochemicals are intermittent and can cease for periods exceeding 12 months which can be determined by circumstances such as primary production returns, the nature of the application requirements and weather conditions. Once again, we've seen beautiful weather conditions in Southland for the last 6 weeks, but I say that facetiously, but the amount of aeroplane activity that's occurred in Southland in the last 6 weeks has virtually been zero. Helicopters have been busy. We support the recommended changes to the General Rural Zone Policy 7 as per the GRAS 42A Report Appendix A for managing noise effects. And we note that it is appropriate to manage noise effects through limiting the number of operational hours in a calendar year in the rural zones, but it's not appropriate to manage noise effects in the rural zones by restricting the locations of airstrips and helicopter landing areas. And one of the points I'd like to make there is that once an aircraft is airborne, the council has no control over that. That's governed by the Civil Aviation Authority. So even if the airstrip or the helicopter landing area is set well back from an oceanal boundary, we can still go up and operate right up to the boundary of that property or within the vicinity of that building, so long as we comply with the civil aviation rules. So I just want to highlight the two main decisions that we seek in terms of agricultural aviation. We seek that the word aircraft be added to Noise R9 Clause 2, and we seek that Noise R9 Clause 3 is deleted. So happy to take any questions on that one before we move on.
Are you understanding of existing use rights?
Sorry, say again?
Are you understanding of existing use rights?
Our understanding of existing use rights are they lapse after 12 months if the activity has ceased for more than 12 months.
Okay, put that part aside in the meantime, or put another way, the existing, and you identified 24 sites that are currently used. So under existing use rights, they can continue the way they are, as you said, provided they're operating each year. Do they operate each year?
Well, in a year like this, no, the answer is no, because as you'll be aware, farmers are watching their checkbooks pretty closely, and secondly, airstrips are that wet that the aeroplanes can't get on them to use them.
Yeah, given I can't even mow my lawns at present because it's still so wet, and we've had 100 mils of rain so far this month again. Now, the aircraft hours issue. My understanding, the same as the way you've expressed it, civil aviation requirements or compliance is necessary once they're in the air, and 315 aircraft hours in a 12-month period doesn't have. Helicopters are flying all around. They could be flying outside the district in that time. And to me, it doesn't appear to be a good measure of the impact that it's having on the site. The district plan can only control aircraft landing while they're on the ground and taking off. And as you've highlighted, sitting on the ground and idling isn't part of the aircraft hours. And that's the part that has the adverse impact. So rather than aircraft hours, what other measure could be used to manage the effects?
That's difficult, and the reasoning behind this is, let's say an aeroplane goes out to an airstrip at 5:30 in the morning, it starts blowing by 7:30, so they sit on the strip all day and wait till 5:30 at night to continue operations. If it's going to be daylight hours, then that chews significantly into that 315 limit. The concern around that is where you've got a hub airstrip that's services more than one farm. In some cases, they'll service half a dozen farms. There is a reasonably high level of activity off that strip, and it becomes a flight safety issue if pilots get to the point where they think they're going to start running out of hours to operate from that strip as a permitted activity. They might carry on, and where the conditions that they shouldn't be carrying on in, they may continue to carry loads that are inappropriate for the conditions that are that they're experiencing. So what we're looking for is a mechanism that allows for a reasonable amount of activity that we can support our farmer clients but not have any direct impact on flight safety.
So what's the difference between a hub and what I call a base?
Okay, so well, a hub could be a base if there was an aeroplane or a helicopter based off it. So we're talking about rural airstrips and helicopter landing areas that are used intermittently, whereas a base would be where there's an aircraft based there permanently, the aircraft come and go on a regular basis, and we don't support that as a permitted activity. We think that that should be subject to a resource consent process. A hub airstrip generally will not have any structure on it other than a bin.
So, Tony, you oppose the 50-metre setback, 500-metre setback, sorry. Can you explain how that has adverse effects on your business or the business of aviation in the agricultural sector?
Well, it's simply access at a time of year like this when it's so wet. Often strips and landing area, helicopter landing areas are right beside access points, because that's where the hard points are to work from, to get support vehicles into and service the aircraft and provide the product that's going to be used for the job.
So that's roads, probably, basically, that we're discussing.
Yep.
At paragraph 3.3, you've talked about amendment to the new Rule 9, Part 1. And it's just the words "or" that you've put in there. So Mandeville Aviation Rail Precinct was part of that. How many operators actually come from the airfield that we've got south of Gore?
2. A base there.
Okay. And none really operate out of Mandeville, do they?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. Okay.
Most of the other operators, other than one, wouldn't be located within the Gore district who come in here and do work.
Okay. Now, if we have a permitted activity, but the landowner's keeping a record of takeoffs and council, and to be available to council on request, how does the council actually find out where they're operating from in order to request details?
Yeah, good luck with that. And, you know, like we'll support a rule like this, but good luck with enforcing it or investigating it. And this is a point we've made to a lot of other councils. And Timaru, in fact, it was one of the reasons why they've dropped potentially dropped some of the limitations around that is, are you making a noose to put around your own neck in terms of going out there, investigating and enforcing? And that's why in the initial submission we said it should be the landholder who's recording that, because he's the only one who knows who's coming onto his property and using his facilities. How am I as a helicopter operator to know when the next fella's going to come in and who's going to be responsible for recording that?
Tony, typically, and I guess you've got to polish this crystal ball, how long would a helicopter sowing nitrogen be on a particular site to service that farm and gone?
If he was doing, let's say, 20 tonne of urea, and it was a Squirrel helicopter, he'll be there for about a little bit over 2 hours. If it's a Robinson R44, he's probably going to be there for 6 to 8 hours. So the effects are short, you know, that they're significant while they're there, but they're for a very short period, very short periods of time.
And there'd be different landings and takeoffs for the different types of helicopter as well, wouldn't there? There'd be more.
Sure, so
So
a Squirrel helicopter doing 20 tonne, if it's a B3, would take 20 loads. A Robinson R44 is probably going to take about 100.
Under the civil aviation requirements, what controls are there in place as to the hours of operation?
On agricultural operations, none, believe it or not. But there is a duty of care, of course, under the Haswar Act for fatigue management, but there's no prescriptive limitations within the civil aviation rules.
But a sensible pilot will not be flying in the dark.
Probably not. But what I would encourage you is think a little bit outside the square, because one of the things that we promote, and your plan didn't pick it up, but is the definition of agricultural aviation activities that we promote includes UAVs, because they are the future, and it's very likely that they will operate at night when the weather conditions are suitable.
We've picked up on those. So I've got nothing more on those. So if anyone else hasn't got any questions, and we'll move on to the Helicopter Association.
Okay, so look, I'm acting as an advocate for the Helicopter Association. The Helicopter Association is another division of the Aviation Industry Association. However, the gentleman who filled the role that I filled for the ag sector has resigned, and the organisation is in the process of appointing someone to replace him. So the helicopter one is a little bit more complex, and the 42A report recognises that there may be occasions and situations where movements from aircraft and helicopters are temporary in nature, and these should be provided for through the plan. The 42A report is recommending some changes by adding a new temporary activity rule, Temp R11. However, the 42A report recommendations reject the submissions from NZHA to delete NOISA R93 and the inclusion of a wider range of activities as temporary helicopter activities. And just for context in the statement in 4.9, I'll just draw your attention to that to replace one power pole would require at least 6 movements. The New Zealand Helicopter Association is aware of concerns and complaints about noise from helicopter operations elsewhere in New Zealand. Generally, these have been linked to urban areas and private or recreational use, such as Waiheke Island and the urban areas of Auckland. It is not considered appropriate to include a blanket limitation to the Gore district based on some concerns in other areas without quantifying the issue in Gore and the relevance of the issues to the district. It is HA's opinion that there is no justification provided for the approach, the setback distances or the number of movements, nor is there any quantification as to the extent such noise effects as to the extent of the noise effects in the Gore district, nor is there any consideration of the costs and benefits associated with this approach. In the Styles report, he states, and I quote, "We consider that the focus of the noise standards should be to control the noise effects from commercial helicopter depots / airstrips that are likely to generate noise effects on a consistent basis," unquote. We support this focus. However, the recommended rule sets to limit temporary movements rather than focus on ensuring that more permanent activities are regulated and require resource consent, hence the bases that you mentioned before. The 32 report and the 42A report both refer to the number of different plans as examples of best practice. We do not accept that these plans are, as assessed, to provide an adequate framework for temporary commercial helicopter activities. And again, I draw your attention to Timaru, in which the Helicopter Association made substantive submissions, and there is a proposal to modify that rule once again, noting that this recommendation is still subject to decisions. So their proposed GRUS 14A per 3 proposes a reasonable setback of 100 metres, but there are no proposed limits on the number of movements. The HA supports the addition of a new 10 par 11 for aircraft and helicopter movements, but seek that it be extended to a wider range of temporary commercial helicopter activities. NZHA supports the deletion of Clause 2, but also seeks the deletion of Clause 3, limiting the number of movements. So in terms of the decisions sought, please refer to the attached strike-through, but given the lack of justification for the setbacks and limitations on movements in the S32 report and the 42A report and the Styles report, the NZHA seeks that noise R93 be deleted and replaced with a clause that clearly limits the use of helicopter landing areas on a regular basis as a depot or base as a permitted activity. So we seek specifically to delete Clause 2 as recommended in the 42A report, delete Clause 3 as previously sought, and add a new clause: the helicopter landing area is not used on a regular basis as a depot or base for commercial aviation activity. The NZHA submission identified a list of specific activities to be provided for. Rather than include such a list, the HA considers that this would be more appropriate to include for the provision of temporary commercial helicopter activities in the rule through a specific definition. And we've outlined what that definition might look like. The NZHA is also concerned that the limitation in 10 par 11 of emergency works is too limiting. It could mean that the use of helicopters in emergency as a permitted activity is limited by section 330 of the RMA and does not provide for the range of situations where such usage is needed or any rectification after the emergency response. It is unclear that any submission sought the change from emergency response to emergency works, and we seek that it be amended back to emergency response as in the notified plan.
Can we talk about temp rule R11 first? Might be best. Glenys, you had a question. The temporary activity rule and emergency response. Yeah.
That we should change emergency response to emergency management. Would that cover? Your thoughts?
I'd have to think about that, whether the connotation is a working connotation or an active connotation, if you understand what I mean. Management, to me, talks about a high-level overview of what's going on and directing activities, where we're actually talking about the activity being undertaken. The concern we've got there is by changing that to emergency works, that's the exact wording in the headline of S330 of the RMA, so it could be very limiting.
So we had talk. Yeah.
We had a discussion around that.
Oh, okay.
But we just need another word there, and you think emergency response is the best?
Yeah, because that's what we do. You know,
Yeah.
we respond to emergencies, we provide services during emergencies, and it's not just declared emergencies. I mean, emergencies, once the declaration's been removed, the work can continue on, and it might be a fire or something like that. That's not necessarily a declared emergency, but our understanding when we talk about emergency is anything like, you know, if there's a northwest wind blows down 4 power poles and there's you need a helicopter to replace 4 power poles, well, that's emergency work. We will consider that to be emergency work.
Simple question. Why do we differentiate aircraft and helicopters? Are helicopters not aircraft?
Yeah, well, if you talk to a helicopter operator and a fixed-wing operator, they'll give you two different answers to that. By definition, if you look at the RMA definition of an aircraft, it doesn't talk about fixed-wing or helicopters, it just talks about lighter than air. And I think we probably did, in our initial submission, probably seek to have that definition included in the plan, because then that wraps into UAVs as well. I probably haven't answered your question, Keith.
Yeah, no, but if you had a submission in, I don't recall that one having come up yet, so might need to have a check on that. The list there talks about infrequent transportation of people, notwithstanding there's a gap in between in and frequent, but what is infrequent transportation of people? Yeah, how do we manage something like that? To me, it's an amorphous.
Yeah, so there might be, you know, in a fire situation where you've got to fly people onto the hill to dig out hot spots, or for further fire containment, or in some sort of response period like that. I think the important thing here is a definite differentiation between something that, as a helicopter it does it ad hocly, might never come and do it again, compared to a helipad that's been set up where regular flights are being taken from. So, for example, if the Croydon Lodge decided to put a helipad in there so the helicopters can come in and pick up clients, take them out onto the rivers around Southland fishing, then we would consider that to be a permanent helipad, and that should be subject to a resource consent process. If someone asks a helicopter to come and pick them up and take them for a day's fishing on the Mataura as a private individual, and they go and land at that house or that person's property and take them and then bring them back, we would consider that to be infrequent.
Okay, looking at the submission as a whole, the plan differentiates between agricultural activities and non-agricultural activities, and they probably need to be thought about differently. Do you agree? Absolutely,
and that's why generally I only deal with the agricultural aviation side of it, because they're two very different issues, and they have different economic and social benefits to the districts. To be brutal, it's easy to sell the agricultural aviation concept because districts like this have a huge investment in the rural production area. It is more difficult to sell the concept around other helicopter activities in particular, especially when there is a perception of a problem. And one of the things I challenge councils is, do you have a problem? How many complaints have you had in the last 10 years that the council's had to deal with? So is this problem perceived, or is it a problem that actually exists?
Tony, you noted the the movements, and you did quote about replacing a power pole. There'd be other cases as well, like alliance buildings, and it wouldn't just where there'd need to be a lot more movements at one time. How does that? But is that what you would call temporary, or is that?
Yeah, sure. So let's say Alliance wanted to replace all the air conditioning units on top of the freezing works. I remember going there with Peter Garden 42 years ago probably and putting them up, the first ones up there. There's probably about 12 up there, so that would require probably around 20 to 25 actual movements, but it might not happen again for another 40 years.
Thanks. And there'd be other examples as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the infrequent commercial helicopter activity you will get is around security of infrastructure for energy communications. And another good example was, most of you probably saw the helicopter flying the big triangular hydrographic surveying thing that was about half the size of a football field. I think it was about 2 years ago. And that was based out of a rural area just north of Gore here. So, you know, during that period he was here, he's probably here for about 6 to 8 weeks. They would be undertaking multiple movements on a good day when the weather was suitable for them to be able to operate, and then there was days where they couldn't operate, and that was a one-off and frequent type of activity that we're relating to here.
Getting back to rural helicopter activity, is there any point having any restrictions on rural? Should it be a permitted activity, much the same as it is today?
Well, it's a permitted activity in 90% of the plans that I've been dealing with over the last 3 years. We understand that in some instances, councils don't like, you know, how long's a piece of string, and they like to see something prescriptive. But to give you a good example, was we appealed the Central Hawke's Bay plan, where they wanted to limit the use of a rural airstrip to 14 days in a calendar year, which simply wasn't going to work, and we walked away from mediation, and that consent order's been signed with no limitations at all. Selwyn, West Coast, I'll withdraw West Coast because they have come back with a wee bit of a curly one on that one. But Selwyn, Waitomo, Dunedin City, Wellington City, Taupo, Mackenzie don't have any restrictions on number of movements, but they do on setbacks. So it's more unusual that a council will try and limit the days or number of movements than it is to be not just a permitted activity. I should be told, we're getting crossed over, that's in terms of agricultural aviation activities. That's not necessarily the case in terms of other helicopter activities.
So you would support just enabling agricultural aviation activities?
Absolutely.
Would it be a more practical approach to make helicopter activities with agricultural activity a permitted activity, but differentiate with lift operations in built-up areas?
Yeah, and they can actually be done, and I know John Stiles, he might even be online, wrote this report, and in a meeting he said that he considers that in that situation they'd actually come under the construction rules.
So it'd be part of the consent, construction
Yep.
consent.
Yep.
That's what I was thinking.
So we've got John online, and I highlighted the construction side. Can John just clarify for us the construction use of helicopters? Have we provided for that in any way?
Good morning. It's a little hard to hear, but I think it's my time to talk. If it's not, please tell me to be quiet. As I understand it, the question is, do the rules provide for helicopters to be used for construction work? The answer is yes, and that would include things like replacing power poles, replacing air conditioning units. A whole variety of work will come under those construction provisions, and the noise limit for those would be anywhere from 70 to 80 decibels, depending on the duration of the construction project. So very high, very liberal. Those rules also apply to the land that the helicopter might be taking off from if that's a different site. The construction noise standard is very clear about any work or activity in connection with construction work. So if it had to take off from a paddock a kilometre down the road, the noise limit there for those neighbours would also be 70 or 75 or 80 decibels, so quite liberal.
I'm wondering whether we need another speaker beside that is actually doesn't have the red light on so that they can hear better. So I guess what, John, what we've heard this morning would suggest to me that there shouldn't be any noise limit applying to the use of helicopters for construction activities. Your view?
Yeah, look, this is an issue that comes up reasonably regularly, and in many districts, I think my experience is that there hasn't been a problem for some period of time, but as there is intensification and a bit of growth, these issues do become apparent, and there are many councils grappling with these issues. Because of a lack of rules and a lack of clear direction in the plan. So that's where my recommendations have come from. But I understand the challenges at the same time. I would be reluctant to see no noise limit at all on this work. I think that the construction noise limits are very liberal, and I've not come across a situation where they have tripped up an activity, other than one case that I can think of, which involved a twin-engine squirrel lifting out sections of trees off a volcano here in Auckland, and it had to work for 10 hours a day and be landing and dropping the logs or the sections of tree very close to houses. When I say very close, in the order of 50 metres. They had an issue with the construction noise limits, but I think that was a pretty exceptional circumstance. In most cases, the separation distances are greater, or the use would be much less over a day, and there's just no issue. But those limits will serve to capture the potential for big projects where it might be inappropriate to have a landing area or takeoff area right next to some houses where that helicopter would be used for long periods. That's what it's designed to capture. Maybe an infrastructure project where Transpower or some company might be using helicopters regularly, and these rules would help to, or would encourage them to site their landing and takeoff areas away from houses, for example.
So is there merit, and I'll look to you first, John, and then Tony, is there merit in terms of construction of actually where there is a certain distance away from a dwelling, actually having a time limit on how much can operate for any activity? So I'm kind of thinking, just pulling some numbers out of the air, that if you're doing construction works within 50 or 100 metres of a dwelling, there's a limit of X number of hours that activity may take place. Is there any merit in looking at that?
Look, I think that would be an ideal response. The only fishhook with that is defining that duration. There is an Environment Court decision from some time ago. It's commonly referred to as the Dome Valley decision, where the court made it very clear that the RMA includes the control of aircraft noise from the ground, so 500 feet above the local area, and from that time on, the helicopter is free to go and do what it likes. But from 500 feet down to the ground, it's controlled by some specific rules, and that's what the Environment Court said is also subject to noise restrictions. So, or to land use controls, I should say. So it gets very difficult to define the amount of time. Is it simply the time between 500 feet and the ground, any ground idle time, and then back up to 500 feet? Is it the entire time that that area is used, or is it just the amount of time that the helicopter's on the ground for? If we could solve that issue, then I think your proposition might be able to work.
Could I just say to that, John, that it's unlikely that in that situation the helicopter would be going above 500 feet. Most construction jobs would be from ground level to 150, 200 feet maximum.
And that's my experience as well, unless that helicopter is going to a site maybe a kilometre away to drop its load or do whatever it's doing, and then come back and pick up more and say take it up the hill, taking gravel up the hill or something like that. That, yeah, it's a bit tricky though.
Could I just put something out there, and John, you may have a view on this. Some plans talk about the number of times an activity can be undertaken under a temporary activity rule, for example, 6 times in a calendar year. Would that approach be useful?
Yes, and interestingly, I was just messaging Ms. Woodbridge by text message to let her know that I'm thinking about another approach, and you've come very close to it. I still need to think it through in my head. And the one catch that I'm thinking of is when a day becomes a day that's counted in a rule like that. Is it when you have one landing or one takeoff or both? Does that comprise an entire day? And I think the answer has to be yes. Otherwise it gets too hard to count. I need to just keep thinking that whole idea through, I think, a little bit, if that's okay. I think it could be an option though.
So is that an option instead of the maximum noise limit, or in addition to?
I think it has to be in addition to, because at the moment we're talking about how to separate out a landing area that's used infrequently and say that use is permitted. But the noise limit is very important, because that needs to apply to any proposal to establish a formal landing area that might be used for a whole range of purposes and on any day of the year, and potentially every day of the year. They are the activities that I'm particularly interested in capturing in this noise limit rule.
So what that's heading towards is possibly, and the panel needs to have a talk about it, issuing a minute requesting further information in terms of the option that's available, and providing submitters such as Tony the opportunity of commenting on it. In that regard, what is the question that we should be asking?
It's a difficult question in itself. Perhaps I could put that in writing to you with the help of Ms. Woodbridge, but I think the question is, how do we draft a rule that satisfactorily and exempts infrequent helicopter use? And I use that word on purpose, and I acknowledge it's very hard to define, and that's the issue. How do we exempt that helicopter use that's infrequent? And then how do we capture the use of landing areas that might see frequent use of helicopters? And I think that the trick is defining that word infrequent by days, hours, distances, noise limits.
There's a plan, sorry, John, there's a plan recently that, and I can't remember what it is, but I can find it, where in the temporary activity rule, it was 6 times a year for no more than 3 consecutive days each time.
Sounds as though both of you have got a useful contribution to make on this further. So I think, and I'm just wondering in terms of the 42A reporter, who is Victoria, whether there's some guidance you want to give us at this time as well, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I generally agree. I think it is the trick, and we talked a bit about this yesterday, is achieving that balance between managing amenity and managing enabling activities, and so trying to put some definition around what might constitute infrequent, rather than trying to define what the purpose maybe that you're using the helicopter for. It's about defining what constitutes infrequent, and that is probably an easier mechanism for everybody, I think. Easier to enforce and monitor, and easier for operators, more certainty for operators. So that's in relation to helicopters, distinct from agricultural aviation as well. I think probably just responding to one thing Mr. Michel said earlier when we were talking around the hours, my understanding, and Mr. Stiles might like to jump in, is the intention is to try and capture that point where the aircraft is making a noise. So if it's idling, it's making a noise. If it's just sitting on the ground, unable to be used, then the intention is not to try and capture that time during the hours, because there's no noise effect from the aircraft then. So the intention is to try and manage the effects when the aircraft is making a noise, rather than it just existing on a site, if that makes sense. So I understand your point about the aircraft ideas, and it's possible that the way we've framed the provision around this concept of hours, it maybe needs some further consideration as well. Is that right, Mr. Stiles? Would you have anything further to contribute on that?
No, look, I think that's right, and that particular issue gets to the heart of the difficulty of counting the amount of time and how we define that. And in my experience, it's very difficult to count the time between, that the helicopter is making noise from its ground operation and then up to 500 feet. It's very, very difficult. My experience is that it's far easier to say that if a helicopter lands on a piece of ground, then that's 1 day of use, and it could land maybe 20 times in that day, and it's still 1 day. But as soon as it lands once, it's 1 day. That is by far the easiest way to count. I acknowledge, though, that it's quite coarse, and I think Tony's input on that particular point might be quite helpful.
Yeah, I agree, John, and one of the that's the issue around the flight safety thing. If a pilot goes there and he does 1 or 2 loads, he's lost a day, and some some plans look to limit, and I think West Coast, the change has been to limit to 30 days in a calendar year. Becomes a flight safety issue if there's not some other parameter around it, and that's why we've promoted as a template rule 30 days or 315 aircraft hours, whichever is the greater, because then that's not, if the pilots are losing a whole lot of days because they've gone there, the weather's been inclement and they've had to leave, they're not under pressure then to try and fit the operations within that 30-day period. They've still got that latitude of 315 hours. And the other point I'd like to make is if the Dome Valley ruling is applied here, then on agricultural operations, the aircraft never goes above 500 feet. It takes off and it gets to 120 feet if it's an aeroplane, and about 30 or 40 feet if it's a helicopter, and that's where it's going to operate in that level for the whole day.
I think to provide a little bit of guidance from the discussions that the panels had earlier and from the responses that we had, we probably see the aircraft hours as not being a particularly practical tool to use. So looking at more certainty, particularly in the definition of infrequent. So I think the discussion that we've had here has been helpful, and I think giving something in writing for everyone to come back to and for further feedback opportunity is probably as far as we can take it today. And as the planner commented, we see a difference between agricultural activities and non-agricultural, and probably a differentiation as well between what I'd call the civil defence type emergencies, and again, different between that, and I'd put it in the same category as almost the agricultural type activity. So thank you for that. And John, is it a lot easier to hear since we put another microphone out there?
It's much better, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, no, it means that it's going through the speaker. So that's all I've got. Thank you. No, thanks.
Oh, this is just a question for you, Tony. Like conservation activities, does that come under agricultural aviation activities, or would that be totally separate?
It does come under agricultural aviation by definition in terms of CAA definition, but not necessarily with within a district plan definition. But I did note that in the original General Rural Zone 42A, it recommended it adopted the exemption, the Section 3 exemption for conservation activities out of the RMA. Is that correct? Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, sorry, I can't recall on that exact point. I was just looking at the definition of agricultural aviation now, and the definition means the use of aircraft or helicopters, but I have recommended that is also includes the UAVs that Mr. Michelle was talking about, and these are used ancillary to and in association with primary production and or conservation activities. So conservation activities is included in that definition of agricultural aviation, and I think that was something that several submitters were happy with.
Tony, how often outside of agriculture and conservation activities are helicopters employed in the Gore district? I guess you've got ferrying people to and from the hospital. I can remember one heavy lift thing in the Mataura area, and only one.
Very infrequent would be my response to that.
I'm just wondering, you know, are we getting bent out of shape about something that is so infrequent that we shouldn't get too carried away with trying to control?
And I'll go back to the original, one of the original statements I made. Is this a perceived problem or an actual problem?
Do we need Mr. Stiles to come back later? Is there any further questions that you would have for him?
I did ask Rachel if she could join early, and she said she could. She's actually here.
Yeah, or bring her on board if you like. So whether we need anything else from John.
So can I just ask him to come back after
I do have some further things to ask John in terms of potentially the railway noise overlay. But we are probably going to issue a minute in relation to that because there's further information we believe that we need. And it's probably best that we get John I'll pick it up as part of that.
Okay, so we don't need to.
No.
Okay, great. I'll let them know. Thank you.
Welcome. We'll receive your submission. What areas of the plan will you be submitting on? What is the topic we should be looking at?
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. Having briefly reviewed the planning evidence which was posted on the website this week, there are a few areas outstanding that I'd like to discuss. So they're in relation to noise. There's a clause within, or policy within the general rule zone, which was covered GRUS P7. And then we're actually satisfied with the outcome for policy CLP1 and the public access amendment, which has been accepted. So thank you to the Section 42A also for that. So I'll just begin with noise. I'll take the majority of the submission as read. However, just in relation to the agricultural aviation definition, we're satisfied with the addition to include unmanned aerial vehicles. So thank you to the author. In terms of helicopter landing area, our submission was to support a amendment from Stony Creek, which included the words including temporarily. However, as provided within the planning evidence, there's been an amendment further on in the plan which covers this off, so we're happy with that definition. In terms of rural airstrip, in my opinion, there is no need to control a rural airstrip in this way because it differs significantly from a commercial airstrip or a helicopter pad where the landings are more regular. However, the exemptions from the setback standard does adequately enable agricultural aviation, in our opinion, and so we're comfortable that no further amendment is required. In regards to noise P4, we think that it's important to acknowledge that infrequent noise will occur from agricultural aviation activities which are temporary in nature by default.
Okay, can you just wait there for a moment, please? I just want to bring that up. Okay, thank you. Proceed.
Thank you. And so then just in relation to noise R8, we maintain our preference that agricultural aviation should be permitted with no conditions. However, we accept the proposed conditions provided NZAAA is happy with these, which we are aware that they generally are, aside from one matter. And I'm sorry, I had planned to listen to their evidence being presented today, but I think with the timing change, it didn't quite work out. So I think that potentially having read the planning evidence, there's now a little bit of confusion around the hours versus aircraft hours. So having gone back to that rule and having another look at it, I think potentially the confusion is in that number 4, which requires the log to be taken. So perhaps, I don't know the specific wording because I've only just reviewed this, but perhaps more clarity is required in what's going to be specified in that log. And I think, you know, from first read of the plan, it isn't clear what hours should be recorded or what should be captured. And it also could be, I mean, recording takeoffs and landings could be problematic if the requirement is to maintain a log just recording the specific takeoff and then landing time. So I would suggest that more detail is provided around the log. And I guess as a result of the discussion with NZAAA, either aircraft hours is included or the hours is increased as recommended by the 42A author.
So I guess it's worth going to our planners and saying what information are you anticipating is collected as part of that log?
Well, the purpose is to capture the information which might, which in the first instance would show compliance with the limit on hours. I think Ms Thomas is right that it is important that that log is, that condition is clear as to what that log should contain. But I think before we can look at that, we need to resolve this issues of hours. And so I think looking at that condition will be wrapped up in how we generally consider this rule going forward.
I just want to make the comment or ask the question from somebody. What's the point of having a log if agricultural aviation and excuse me, the Fed's representatives is addressing agricultural aviation, which is infrequent, and I can't see the point, honestly, but looking for some guidance to convince me otherwise.
If I might just jump in. So the purpose of the log only really makes sense in relation to the limit on hours. So if you're having a limit on hours, then the purpose of the log is to record that. So you don't have council staff having to go out and, you know, waste time monitoring that. So the log is that purpose. So that's why I think if we're looking at this issue of the hours, we need to wrap that, the purpose of that log up into that. And I guess, you know, you've asked a bigger question there, and the purpose of the rules is to try and capture noise effects, and we do recognise that some noise, you know, will be infrequent, and so try to be enabling in that regard. But I guess it's about drawing a line in the sand as to when infrequent is not infrequent, and when it has the potential to become a nuisance. And that's what we've tried to do with the rules, but it sounds like from the previous discussion there's a little bit more work to do in that regard.
I guess I'd make the comment, a limit on hours or a log on hours is actually by default a limit on the activity. If you're applying fertiliser, for example, you're actually, through a rule like that, limiting how much fertiliser, application of fertiliser, or you could be encouraging the helicopter operator to carry heavier loads, which you don't want to be doing. Take your point. Thank you.
And Rachel, part of the discussion that we had with the Helicopter Association was lending towards something coming from the panel, asking our advisors and giving submitters the opportunity to give feedback in terms of helping identify what are infrequent uses. We see that is, I guess, is something tidied up, and just given the feedback from the planner, then so if there's a rule that limits time, limits the number of days, maybe a log is needed. If those limits are in there, then the need for it disappears. I did ask the question of how the council finds out whether helicopters are using a particular site in order of asking to see the log, and unless there's a complaint received from adjoining people, we probably wouldn't know. So that just updates you in terms of the talkies that we had beforehand.
Thank you. I think it's also it's confusing with that number 4 as well, because the way that it reads is that you record the time that you take off and then the time that you land. But then from the narrative within the planning evidence, it's saying that it's not capturing hours in the air because that's outside the scope of the plan, but it's only capturing the hours that it takes you to take off, the hours it takes you to land, and then the hours that your plane or your helicopter is on while it's refueling on the ground. So I think from a practical perspective, that would be very difficult to record. And then also, yeah, within the log, it needs to be clear about what exactly you're trying to capture and what you're trying to manage. So, so yes, I'm sure that Mr. Michelle would have provided some good feedback for you on that.
Just want to put that in a practical context. After talking to Tony, asking him how long a helicopter would take to spread 20 tonnes of fertiliser, and he made the point, depending on the size of the helicopter, either 2 hours or 6 hours, and if you were to assume that that activity would be happen once every 6 to 8 weeks, but not in the winter time, you would have a maximum for a smaller machine in 1 year, 36 hours, for a larger machine, 12 hours. It's a non-issue.
In your view?
Sorry, in my view, and I'm actually shouldn't be declaring a view at this stage. It's a question I'm asking for of other commissioners to get their feedback when we do deliberate.
Okay, Rachel, is there anything? Yeah, anything else you want to cover?
Sorry, if I may just add, in our opinion, if you removed the requirement for the aircraft hours, but you still maintain the log, so you're still recording the takeoff and the landing of the aircraft, that would be a reasonable approach.
Okay, anything else?
That's all, thank you.
Hand over to our helicopter expert. Any more questions? Thank you very much for your input. And I think that's the end of our submission phase for today. No, we've got... Yeah, that is the end. Look, we will adjourn now and...
Reconvene on Thursday.
Yeah. Thursday, 9:30. Thank you very much for everybody who's attended and contributed.
Thank you.